Welcome to Trauma Informed Customer Service. My name is Amy de la Torre. I am the Adult Behavioral Health Manager at an organization in Clackamas County called Northwest Family Services. Some of you, if you live up there, I hope have heard of us. I will save you the effort. My shirt is for the Burn Funding, which is a group that has been There are groups in every county in Oregon that specifically serve people who have substance use disorders, trying to save lives and increase access to treatment. So it's one of my favorite t-shirts, so I wore it while I get to do one of my favorite things, which is chat with you lovely people. I myself am a licensed clinical social worker. I told a couple of people this morning already, this is a huge topic. When we talk about what trauma-informed care is, which is not the term I chose for this for a reason, it is an enormous topic. I spent an entire semester diving into what trauma-informed care was when I was in graduate school, and now we're gonna try and slam that all into about an hour and 15 minutes, and we will not be successful. So I want to give you fair warning. If you are coming to this workshop with full expectation that you will leave today trauma-informed, I am not going to be able to do that for you. And if you came to this workshop with expectations that you will leave knowing exactly how to apply trauma-informed care to everything that you do in your job, I'm also not going to be able to provide that to you. Today is a limited resource, and most of what we are going to spend our time doing is understanding what it means for us as people to be trauma-informed. We will go through some examples, and I'm leaving time at the end for question and answer, and then as you have questions as we go, please feel free to pop a hand in the air. I might tell you we need to wait a second. I might answer you right then. That way you can kind of problem solve as we go and think about how this applies to your job. But we have an incredible diversity of workers in this room, right? So who in this room works in social service specifically? Yeah, okay, a handful of people, right? Who works in the more like business end of things? I don't even know what that means. That's so not me, right? I'm like the most generic term in the world, right? What are some of the other fields we have in the room? Housing, yes, fantastic. Higher education? Higher ed, yeah, right? This conversation gets into education a lot and is very, very interesting because there's been a lot of conversation with children about how it gets applied to classrooms, but not always so much when it gets to the college level. And it really would be beneficial if it could, right? So I can't tell you exactly how to apply this to your higher education job or your housing job because then I wouldn't be talking to everybody. But we're gonna talk about kind of the spirit of what we're doing so that you can get into that space and bring it forward. Because at the end of the day, trauma-informed care is not a way that you serve people. It's an approach that you bring from within yourself when we serve people, right? I do trauma-informed care when I go home at the end of the night and my spouse has had a hard day, right? And he does for me too. Right? I do trauma-informed care when I talk to my employees, just as much as when I talk to our clients, right? I happen to work in a really clinical field, but we're doing this all day, every day, because it's a spirit that we bring into our work. It's not the way we do the work. Does that make sense? Okay. And we've just done a little trauma-informed care. We'll talk about setting expectations as a part of trauma-informed care a little bit later. Yes?
Hey, Amy,
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Educational credits. So if anyone in the room is looking to receive that, I think we have 5 folks who signed up. Would you raise your hand and I'll pass this around and get you registered or signed in?
Our folks who need CEUs. Thank you. I said I was going to remember and then I didn't. So, classic. So when we talk about trauma-informed care, I'm also using the phrase of creating a more trauma-conscious community, right? That we would remember that trauma is informing everything that people who have experienced it interact with in the world, right? And what is trauma, right? Maybe some of you have heard this in an incredibly medical sense, right? So people talk about traumatic brain injuries, right? Someone gets into a car accident, for example, and they experience a traumatic brain injury. It alters the way that their brain functions ongoing. right? We've probably heard about potentially childhood trauma, right? The difficult experiences people have when they're a small person who doesn't have all the skills to navigate the world yet and very vulnerable, right? Sometimes trauma is something that happens to us when we're an adult, right? Trauma can be all types of things, and there is no universal definition of what trauma is, right? But I really like this quote from Resmaa Menakem, which is that trauma is also a wordless story our body tells itself about what is safe and what is a threat. Trauma is not the things we go through, it's what happens afterward. There are experiences you may have had that you did not internalize as trauma, but the person sitting next to you might have, right? It's the story we tell ourselves. It's the story our bodies tell ourselves about how to remain safe in this world. And that is often where we see people come into our space with behaviors that historically have been labeled as maladaptive or problematic or irrelevant to the situation, right? And we'll get a little bit more into that. But so when we think about this, what do we mean when we're talking about being trauma-informed, right? So when we talk about being trauma-informed, I gotta grab my paper or else I'm gonna get off track. I'll get too excited. When we talk about being trauma-informed, this term is not particularly old. So the term trauma-informed got really hot about 10 years ago, actually, when Bessel van der Kolk came out with his book, The Body Keeps Score. Has anyone heard of that book? I see nodding, yes. Right? This is considered to be, in our culture, the preeminent, the perfect, the most important book on trauma-informed care. And I beg to disagree. And that is because Bessel van der Kolk did not come up with trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is actually a concept that's existed in culture and communities long before we even had a practice called counseling or social work, right? It far predates anything that we use as a clinical practice today. In fact, trauma-informed care specifically has been found to be a very clean match with a lot of indigenous wisdom from the United States and Central America that recognizes that the experiences that we have integrate into our body and move forward with us, right? Indigenous communities in the United States have actually started using the term healing-informed care, which I really love because, can anyone guess why I like that better than trauma-informed care? Yes, it's hopeful, it's action-oriented, it's focused on what happens when we treat people with a consciousness for their experience, right? It is not defining people by where they've been solely, right? But you can't heal from something that didn't happen, right? It can acknowledge the past and the future at the same time, right? When it comes to the term trauma-informed care, as it's kind of caught speed over the last decade or so, we've looked at something called the ACEs study. Has anyone heard of the ACEs study? Okay, so the ACEs study started in 1994. This is gonna be my really quick history lesson. The ACEs study started in about 1994. They studied 1,700 people, and what they did was, it was because Kaiser wanted to save money. That's what it was for. It's not about treating people, was not about therapy, had nothing to do with mental health actually, right? They wanted to save money. And so they wanted to figure out what are people experiencing that is increasing health outcomes that cost the system a lot of money, namely substance use disorders, right? And diabetes were two of the big things that they were trying to figure out how to make sure that didn't happen. And when they studied it, what they wound up finding was that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which they categorized into a few categories. I'll show you those in a second, sorry, I put those in the wrong order. Increased people's health outcomes over time. So for example, if someone experienced On here, we have 20% of people reported 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, but 67% experienced at least one, right? At least one adverse childhood experience, which is something that had negative health outcomes for them later on, not directly related, such as, it has maternal depression, which drives me crazy, but that's how they studied it. Emotional or sexual abuse, substance abuse in their home as a child, domestic violence in their home as a child. These are all things that people experienced pre-18. Physical or emotional neglect, the experience of parents divorcing, mental illness of a parent, incarceration of a parent, or homelessness or houselessness, right? These were the things that they looked at, and what they found was that if people experienced one of these, some of these things increased. And as we looked at over here, if people experienced 3 of these, for example, they were 17 times as likely to experience heroin addiction in their lifetime. Why? Why? It's a real question. Yeah, maybe it's a learned behavior, right? We know that substance abuse, I'm a substance abuse person, so not person, but counselor. And so this is my little hill at the moment, right? Maybe they learned it from a parent, right? Maybe it became a coping skill. One of the things we talk about in my office a lot is that people aren't escaping nothing, right? Substance abuse is a perfect example of intentional disassociation. Disassociation is one of those behaviors we will see, or trauma responses we will see in people as a response to something that they are determining or their body is determining is a threat, right? People go blank, they seem confused, they don't remember what's happening. And that's actually because your body is your best friend. Your brain wants to disassociate. It is doing you a favor. Because in a moment when something on this list is happening, do we want to remember every detail? No, of course not, right? So your brain does you the fantastic favor of saying, I'm just gonna float off over here. Whatever's happening to my body is not going to happen to my brain. I will do everything in my power to remember as little about this as possible. The trouble is, your brain is incredibly efficient. And so the more negative, difficult, hard things happen to you, the more they happen to us, the more often our brain has to disassociate, and the better it gets at it, right? And the better it gets at it, the more it becomes a habit or an immediate reaction, and the more difficult it is to engage with the world at large, right? If I can't remember what's happening, it's gonna be really hard for me to hold down a really good job, right? Or when people choose an intentional form of disassociation like substance abuse, right? I am saying it was actually a lot better when I didn't know what was happening, so I'm gonna make sure I get back there by force, essentially, right? And so it increases. When people have more things they wanna forget, they might work a lot harder to forget them, right? The other things that we talk about when we talk about trauma that people have experienced is the things that happen in our community, right? So we have some housing people here, right? Is a perfect example of when people are having difficulty, there's poor housing quality or affordability, right? That actually increases people's risk to the things above this line, right? As well as intensifies their results. Right? So if someone is experiencing the divorce of their parents and you had a dual income household that had difficulty maintaining stable housing, right? And then those two people split and have to maintain separate households, right? We see how these play together. I would also be regretful, I suppose, if I didn't talk about the idea of communal trauma as well when we're forming an idea of trauma, right? And communal trauma is trauma that happens to a specific community, right? So there is transgenerational trauma. Transgenerational trauma affects either a group of people with a shared cultural identity. So we use examples like the American slave trade, the Holocaust, right? We can also use examples like 9/11, right? Which was an experience that was known by people worldwide, but was experienced by Americans, particularly Americans in New York, on a more intimate and intense level, right? Transgenerational trauma can also be the repetitive experiences that happen in a singular family. I always use the example of transgenerational trauma as I remember a young woman that I worked with in a residential facility, and we were convinced that she must have experienced some truly horrendous abuse, right? Just the responses she had every symptom of PTSD in the book, except for she didn't have flashbacks, and she couldn't remember having ever been through anything that difficult, right? Overall, she had had a fairly protected life. And we talked to her, and one day her mom comes in for a family session and sits down with the counselor, had never talked to a counselor in her life, mom hadn't, and starts weeping and telling the counselor about all of the difficult things that she had experienced as a young woman. She'd come from a horrendous abuse situation, and she had taught her daughter that way of interacting with the world. She had coached and taught and protected her daughter from all of the things she hadn't been protected from, but in so had conditioned her daughter to respond to non-threatening things as threats, right? Transgenerational trauma is interrupted in our systems, right? But it's also interrupted in our homes when we stop to heal the things that we've experienced and we don't pass them down to the next generation. And in this, there is also collective trauma. This tends to be a little bit more where my 9/11 example would fall in, which is a psychological reaction to a traumatic event that affects an entire society, right? So again, sometimes that can be a microcosm society. These aren't specifically distinct ideas from each other, right? They have some overlap in different communities. But it can also be the collective memory of an event, right? That happened to a group of people. Trauma forces us to adapt in order to experience safety. Trauma response is not a maladaptive skill. It is an incredibly adaptive skill. It's just not adaptive to the situation at hand. Does that make sense? We're going to try something. I'm going to put a picture on the screen, and I want you to squint until you see the pretty lady. And then raise your hand when you can see her. Great. It's usually a little easier on the big screen, which is unfortunate. Did anyone have to squint? Squint until you can really see her. She's got lipstick on and stuff. You got to go for it. Not just see her, but really see her. Okay, you can unsquint, and then squint again until you can see her. Was it quicker that time? Yeah, right? Why? Yeah, it was a little bit of muscle memory. Okay, now I want you to squint till you can see her and then freeze in that squint. What's the lowest letter you can read? Okay, you can unsquint. When we have had to adapt in order to see straight, we are not going to see the world the way it expects us to, right? If I have astigmatism. That's literally what made me think about this, right? And when I don't wear my glasses, I squint at stuff all the time, and then I'll hand my husband my glasses, and he just laughs, right? At my super uneven eyesight. And he's like, how do you see like this? I was like, I don't know, I just learned to, right? I think about when I was in high school, before I got glasses, because no one noticed that I needed glasses, myself included. The doctor told me that this eye, which is the one with really intense astigmatism, had just shut down, right? I had to turn my eye back on as a high schooler because my body went, oh, okay, well, if you're not going to use it, right? We'll just adapt because our bodies are our friends. They're just really protective friends, right? And sometimes they're that friend who's like, show me where he's at, I'm gonna get him, right? And you're like, that's actually like, they just didn't text me back, like it's cool. Like you don't actually have to do all that, right? But we actually have to stop and intervene in order to teach our bodies that something else is safe. And the unfortunate part of what happens if your friend goes out and punches somebody who didn't text you back, maybe they're like gonna get arrested, right? And it was just because they were trying to help. Sometimes there's incredibly negative consequences to that protection. And so when we talk about being trauma-informed, what I want you all to take away is not just an understanding of what trauma does to us, but an understanding of how to interrupt what trauma is doing to the people around you, right? How to not exclude or harm people further because they're just squinting. What once kept you safe may no longer serve you. This is my favorite phrase to say to people in trauma therapy. To take on what people are bringing to the table without judgment, right? You are doing something because it worked. Trauma response is an evidence-based practice. They're doing it for a reason, because it worked on whatever level. People are making choices for real reasons. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's still the best choice for this time, right? Trauma-informed care offers understanding to seemingly irrelevant behaviors. I love and hate the phrase irrelevant behaviors. This is actually a phrase that I lifted from one of the original people who we trace back to having kind of talked about trauma-informed care. And I say trauma-informed care because of my love-hate relationship with this phrase, right? Irrelevant behaviors takes out the idea that it's a bad or a good behavior, which I love about it, right? It's just simply irrelevant. But the problem is, it's not irrelevant to the person with the behavior. It is incredibly relevant. They are doing it for a reason. They are saying those words to you for a reason. They are yelling at you for a reason. They walked out when you needed to keep talking to them for a reason. They shut down and didn't come to work the next day for a reason. Just because people have a reason doesn't mean we need to allow it to continue. But knowing that people have reasons for the thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and choices they're making helps us hold a trauma consciousness so that we can create space to problem solve together, right? We often call the trauma response flipping your lid. Flipping your lid comes from a really simple thing that we actually taught kids back in the day. This comes from school-based trauma-informed care. I say back in the day as though we're not still doing this, right? Which is this little image, which is basically your brain, right? So this is your prefrontal cortex, which makes all your best decisions. That's the part of your brain that they tell you isn't finished cooking until, well, they keep pushing it back. I feel like mine has never been finished because every time I get older, they're like, it's actually your age now. But we estimate it's somewhere around 27, 28, which I am not any longer. It's your problem-solving center, right? When something goes wrong, this is the part of your brain you use. And back here, your little thumb, is your amygdala, which holds all your big, strong feelings. And when trauma response happens, we go whoop, and we flip our lid. Instead of using all of our good, smart problem-solving skills that we almost definitely have, we use our feelings to protect ourselves. Sometimes people call this the watchdog of the brain, right? Do you know what's behind the watchdog? Our memory center. Because your brain wants to protect you. It doesn't want you to take things forward that it thinks are unsafe for you, right? But as we've been talking about, what happens when your brain does this every time something's uncomfortable? My favorite example with teenagers is to be like, you know how you don't remember anything that happens in math class? It's funny, but it's also true. Because the more experiences of trauma we have, and the more experiences of re-traumatization we have, right? This response does not require repetitive trauma. It can require one trauma and zero healing. Because we keep repeating it. We repeat the skill that worked for us, and it keeps kind of feeling like it's working, right? People have gotten as far as they've gotten. They've gotten to your office, to your front desk, to your doorstep, right? Making this work for them. It's just not working as well as it could be. But it started from a time that it was really working, right? So that's when people start to have that difficulty with concentration, with recall. They can detach from reality, right? And detach from impulse control as well. And this is where those behaviors, thoughts and feelings that drive behaviors, show up that we really don't enjoy having with the people we serve, right? Whether it's, again, what are some examples? I'm just gonna ask for some honesty, if I can, from those who are comfortable. What are some of your least favorite things that people you serve do? Who's got one? Raise your hand. It's all good. Yeah. Lie. Oh, yes. Why might someone lie? To hide things, right? Can we think of an experience someone might have had where lying was the absolute safest choice for them? Yeah. Is it the safest choice with you? No, probably not. I'm guessing. You have a very safe aura, so I'm just presuming. Right? It drives me crazy when my clients come in and lie to me. I'm like, I literally can't help you. We have a program where people have to meet a certain level of care in substance use treatment, and they'll come in and be like, I smoke weed once a year. And I'm like, no, you don't, and I can't help you unless you tell me the truth, right? But why would they tell me that? Oh, well, because their kids were taken away last time they tested positive for meth, so they have actually a pretty good motivation to not want to be honest about their substance use. It had a really traumatic response previously, right? What's something else our clients do or the people we serve do that drives us insane? Show up late. Why do people show up late? Yeah, they have other responsibilities or avoidance, difficulty with concentration or recall, right? If you have a hard time remembering things, you're gonna have a hard time remembering where you need to be when. Or remembering the lesson from last week that was, hey, actually I have to leave the house 20 minutes early instead of 5 minutes early to get to my appointment on time, right? But what happens when that person, it's a perfect example, not saying you do this, to be clear. What happens when that person walks into my office, right? And this is the third time they've been late, and I'm like, when are you gonna do something different? What happens? I re-traumatize them. I re-engage the message that they are already telling themselves that they are insufficient, that they are not meeting the mark. I make them feel shame, and I make them feel guilt, and I make them recoil. Or I make them attack. And I say, I was just telling them the truth. They are overreacting. Right? They are overreacting. Has anyone ever had someone come into their job and just start yelling at them out of nowhere? Show of hands, right? That's why I love talking about trauma-informed customer service, because that's one of the top jobs where you're like, you were yelling at me and it's super not my fault. Whenever I get worked up with a customer service person because Comcast is the worst or whatever, I really try to make a point to be like, this is not about you. I just really don't respect what your company's doing, right? But that took me a lot of work, right? Because what happens when we walk in and we don't get the thing that we think we need? We go back into survival mode, right? And it doesn't matter that yelling at you is irrelevant to the situation. You know it's not going to change anything. You know it's only harming things, actually, right? Because how many times does a person get to walk into your office and yell at you before someone, you or someone else, says, actually, like, we need to just not serve that person because they're getting a little aggressive, right? Which is fair. It's fair. Trauma-informed care is not about you guys putting yourselves in danger, so we're not doing that, right? But re-traumatization rips people back to the moment of their initial trauma, right? So one of the things that you will notice as you become more trauma conscious is you will notice that if you know what a major trauma in someone's life is, when they get really upset, you can notice their age change. I always give the example to just pick on myself because my husband laughed at me very hard, appropriately, I think, the first time he saw me do this, is when I get incredibly frustrated, like really worked up, I stomp. Who stomps? 2-year-olds. I look like a big old 2-year-old, right? Why do I look like a big old 2-year-old? Because that sounds like just about when I figured out the world wasn't a very safe place. We go back to that moment. We have a lot of, in my field, we have a lot of people who are like, it's like working with a teenager. Yeah, for a reason, right? People get stuck in the moment of their trauma. And sometimes people heal through that, but often, and I will say this is true for every one of you in this room, in your hardest moment, you go back to it, right? Whether it was 2 years old, 12 years old, or 22 years old, we go back to that moment because we're going back to those skills. We have to reconnect with that part of ourselves that knows how to keep us safe, right? So what does trauma-informed service look like, right? We've talked a lot about what trauma informs in who we are, but what does trauma-informed service look like? What do I want you to take forward as something that you're being conscious of, right, as you leave this room, in as much as I can give you that lesson today, because, again, limited time. Trauma-informed care realizes that the impact of trauma is widespread and that there are different paths for people to recover on, right? Trauma-informed care doesn't say, oh, you just have to go to therapy, right? Therapy is wonderful. I would be in a silly profession if I disagreed, right? But sometimes that's not what it is. Sometimes you responding with calm and kindness is a healing moment someone will bring forward with them, right? I'm not encouraging you to go out and therapize everyone who walks into your office now. I actually would, please don't, right? Unless that's your job, then go ahead, right? But don't do that. But your effort to be conscious of the trauma people bring in is inherently a healing act. Trauma-informed care recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved within the system. That 61% of people who have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and again, those are only the things that happen to people before they're 18, is not only the people we serve. It's us. It's me. It's the people who work for you. It's the people you work for, right? And it responds by fully integrating that knowledge into our policies, our procedures, and our practices. One of the things that you're going to get emailed out to you is from Trauma Informed Oregon, which is a really fantastic resource that you can use. They've got a ton of PDFs, but there were a couple I specifically pulled for you guys. One is on hotspots, which is a way to notice places that your practice or your agency is particularly struggling to be trauma-informed in this area. And another is just an agency checklist of different things that you can look at and say, hey, these are different simple ways we can become trauma-informed. And some of that is in our policies and procedures. It is something as simple as making sure you use a clear bathroom sign instead of just like the cutest one, right? I decorated a whole new therapy space, and I had to spend a lot of consciousness in being like, I want things to be like cool and cute because I'm cool and cute. But, thank you. But I also need them to be approachable because this isn't my space, right? So having a clear sign so people know where they're going is actually trauma-informed care, right? Because I know when I'm trying to go to the doctor's office and I cannot figure out which suite in that random giant building they're in, I am so stressed out and or late and or then I just don't go and then I don't get that medical care that I need. And all of those things happen because of my trauma, but a welcome sign that says, hey, go to this place, interrupts it, right? You're not responsible to make sure that the people that you interact with never get re-traumatized again. But what you can do is find the ways you can interrupt that process, right? Re-traumatization will happen for as long as healing doesn't. Trauma-informed care is how you interrupt re-traumatization in all of the ways that you are willing and able to, right? I like the phrase actively resists. Yeah.
Something we're looking at is intake procedures.
Yes.
And, a common example is just like gender categories are not
Yes.
inclusive enough.
Uh-huh.
So when we are trying to be aware, is it enough to interrupt that trauma process to say, I'm so sorry, these are the only options? Like, is just the acknowledgement enough?
Acknowledgement is fantastic and is actually a specific thing I have to talk about, but let's talk about it right now, right? One of the things I kind of joked earlier, be like, we're doing trauma-informed care by me setting your expectations, right? Why? Because you know what's coming, right? When people are having experiences of abuse, right? One of the worst parts, there are many worst parts, but one of them is the not knowing when that's going to repeat, right? So sitting in unknown significantly elevates anxiety for people holding trauma experiences, right? So telling you, here's what you're gonna experience with me here today is a way to lower your anxiety and make sure that you remember more of all the wonderful things I say. I can anticipate, not expect, but anticipate that you will have learned more because I told you what we were gonna do and you weren't waiting for being like, but when's she gonna tell me exactly what to do, right? You're not distracted by what you're trying to figure out is gonna come because you know what's going to happen. So you can be more present and it lowers your anxiety. So a lot of times that acknowledgement can act as that, can say, hey, we're limited here, right? That's also a place where I often advocate for being like, I like to just put a fill in the blank for gender. Why does it need to be a checkbox, right? Obviously, we all work with, not we all work with, but many of us work with data and things like that, and we can be limited by that. But here's the truth. Your client doesn't need to know that you need to put them in a male or female category for the data collection. You can still put something on your form that lets them self-describe. You just know that that doesn't go into the database. That's okay. It still gives them the opportunity to be seen in your space, right? So it's a dual, you're not gonna get me to say whether something's enough, I guess is also the answer, right? It's kind of never enough, right? We're all just working together to interrupt that re-traumatization as often as possible. And acknowledgement is absolutely a skill to do that. Would have been my quick answer. Principles for trauma-informed anything, right? There are, depending on who you ask, maybe there are 4 skills for principles of trauma-informed care. Maybe there are 8 skills. Maybe there are 7 or 6 or 5. People break them down into all different ways. I have chosen to kind of group them into 4 basic principles for you just for ease, right? Number 1 is safety. Safety is an interesting principle because it's less something that we act on and it's more the foundation of everything we're doing in trauma-informed care, right? If we go all the way back to my quote from the beginning, right? If trauma is a wordless story that our bodies tell ourselves about what is safe and what is a threat, our effort in trauma-informed care is to help bodies learn new definitions of what is safe, to establish that what is happening is not a threat, right? And safety is the underpinning of all of that, both physically and mentally, right? Making sure that if someone has an appointment at a time, you're there when that appointment happens, right? So they can know what to expect from you. Creates mental safety. Physical safety can be not talking to someone about their difficult situation in the lobby when you see them, right? And we're like, hi, how you doing? So you were telling me about your mom last week. Why don't we come in here? And all of a sudden, I've just put you on blast to this whole room of people, right? I'm not going to do that, right? As well as physical safety, just people knowing that they're not going to be physically harmed in a space, right? I don't think any of you are out to physically, like, you're not like pinching the people who come into your office, right? Like, I hope not, right? Like, I don't think you're like out to physically harm people, but establishing for people that they're physically safe is incredibly significant. And that is something as simple as like, I am a touchy person, just am, right? And so if I go to touch someone, I don't. I do a lot of hover hands at work because that's just my that's what I have to do because it's such an instinct, right? Or if I have an ongoing relationship with someone, I talk to them about that. Like, would this be all right? Does this feel comforting, right? Engaging with that consent, which is another portion of what we're doing here, right? The other thing is to establish trustworthiness, right? We do this through transparency and we do this through truth. This is, yes, I think so. Both the most disliked and most sort of like misused section of trauma-informed care, right? Because you sort of have people on two ends. You have people either being like, well, are we gonna, we're just gonna lie to people, we're just gonna baby them, right? We're never gonna ask them to do anything hard. This world's gotten soft, right? Like, you get that from people. And then you have people on the other end who maybe are using trauma-informed care as a way to not deal with their own trauma response, which is to never do any conflict with anyone ever. Trauma-informed care includes conflict. I am not avoiding telling the truth to the people I serve. What I am doing is working very hard to make sure that they know this space of truth is safe. It is safe for us to speak truth here. I am going to tell you that you've been late to 3 appointments in a row and we got to figure this out, right? What are we going to do? But it's safe for us to have that conversation. The other is collaboration. What did I just say? What are we going to do? This is, if you know anything about peer services or peer support services, that is often put as another section of trauma-informed care. Another principle is peer services. I've kind of sectioned that under collaboration for our purposes today, which is the idea that long before Mr. Freud was talking about talk therapy and psychoanalysis and beginning conversations on how people's childhood might affect them, there were people exiting mental health facilities saying out loud, that wasn't helpful. And those are our original peers. That the people who have been through our systems speak into our systems, right? And that can include the people who are in our systems now, right? Getting feedback from the people who are in your system now, right? Or in that moment, collaborating on problem solving can really take the gas out of a big behavior really fast. Because, this is not actually true about me, but I'll use the example for a client, right? My dad sure didn't stop to say sorry when I got upset with him. So I'm ready for you to be like, no, you have to do what I say. And when I just stop, take a deep breath, and go, I'm sorry, that was clearly really frustrating for you. What can we do about this together? Whew. Just really takes the steam out of it because it interrupted, right? The flow that I was on, I was replaying an old story and I was ready for it to repeat. And however often when I walk out into the world, it does. It does. But when I interrupt that, I create space for a new pattern to start. And that can only happen with the person who is experiencing the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors input. And equal input, right? They don't get to like put the bow on the package. They're wrapping the whole thing with us, right? Does that make sense? And then empowerment, right? Which is really the result, but also where a lot of the practices of trauma-informed care come into place. So that means consent. I don't do anything without the people I serve's consent, unless it is an absolute buck wild emergency, right? There are certain situations where we just kind of can't because we're trying to keep somebody alive, right? If I Narcan somebody, I'm not stopping to get their consent because it's impossible, right? Just doing it. Agency, which is their ability to choose how they're going to engage, and then choice, right? So they get to be entirely their own self is agency, and then choice is how we allow people to choose, right? And sometimes that's as simple as like the types of choices we give little kids of like, you are totally welcome to still come into your appointment, and you are totally welcome to decide that you actually don't want to work with me today. Because they are. Right? Instead of being like, well, you got to get in here right now or we're not going to be able to do this, right? It's like, you are welcome. I have this conversation, I feel like, every other day with the clients that are intensive outpatient. You are more than welcome to go smoke a cigarette right now, but that will be a choice to not come to group because you'll be late. So you let me know which one you want to do, right? It's your choice because it is your choice. It's your choice to take on whatever consequences are going to happen. Trauma-informed care is not shielding people from consequences. Overall, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's deciding that the consequence isn't actually that important, right? This person raised their voice twice, and so we exit them from the program. Maybe that's not that important, right? But if someone physically threatens someone twice, maybe we still have that rule, right? That's where we get into the policy and procedure, is thinking about, are we doing something because it's what's been done, or are we doing something with thought and intention for safety, both for the person we're interacting with, but also for the other people in the space, right? Sometimes that's where we get into those really difficult calls. Is this making sense? Okay, good. We're doing all right. We're gonna dive a little deeper into each of these, and then we'll go into some worker skills, which are for you, but they're also for you to kind of share with the folks that maybe you supervise as well. And then we'll do some Q&A. So with safety, when we're talking about safety, we want to talk about safety from physical harm, right? So this can be something as simple as people knowing who to call if they're having a difficult time. So sometimes that posted signage. It also, I will give you an example of a trauma-informed care thing we've been doing with a treatment court I work with, which is many of our participants have been traumatized by the law enforcement system, right? By nature of the fact that they are in a court, they have had a traumatic experience, probably with law enforcement, even if that cop was real nice to them, right? And however many of them have had enough interactions with law enforcement, or even just one that went real sideways, right? So we need to have someone available to the courtroom in case something goes bad. That officer doesn't stand in the courtroom. They stand in an office on the other side of the wall where clients do not have to be staring at this police officer, right? He's there if we need him. Otherwise, he basically doesn't exist. He's okay with it, don't worry. He has consented to this, right? That gives our participants a sense of physical safety, right? Because that officer could represent the threat of physical harm to them if that's been the type of interaction they've had with law enforcement previously, right? It's also safety from shame, right? Shame is one of the top things that will take a re-traumatization from 3 to 10 real fast, right? Shame shows up in our voice. Shame shows up in our systems, right? If it's on our mind to make sure the person that we're working with knows that they did something wrong, you're probably creeping into being shaming. They should know the expectations. They should know the consequences. They already know they did something wrong. You really don't have to double down on that one, right? So we take the example of someone being late again. Sorry, I'm just really harping on you, right? We take the example of someone being late. You know what? No, somebody lies to me. And I know they lied to me, right? Because I found out that the opposite was true. Or you have the really fun one where they like text you and they're like, ha ha ha, I just lied to my counselor. And you're like, oh, it's still me, hi. Cool, let's talk about that later, right? Trauma-informed care is I don't call them right then and be like, so you lied to me, right? Trauma-informed care is I text them and say, that's good to know. When's the time we can talk about that? Trauma-informed care is me stopping to ask why they made that choice, right? Rather than telling them that the choice was wrong. Because they are real people with a real reason for that choice. And if they made that choice because it was just an instinct, the truth is, the second you give them the option to tell you, 50-50, they might just say, yeah, I don't really know why I did that. And now we're having a much better conversation than them feeling like they have to defend themselves against me. Because I'm like, you know you shouldn't lie. Of course they know they shouldn't lie. Of course they do. People say it 18 billion times throughout our lifetime, and yet we all still do it, right? And that's part of the empathy in this as well, is to remember, you do these things. You might not walk into a storefront and start yelling at someone, right? But you have behaviors that you react with when you start to feel unsafe. You have things you do. And just because they don't look like the person you're serving doesn't mean that yours are somehow more valid just because they're more culturally palatable. Thank you. And in that, safety from rejection. If I am convinced that if I call back my housing person, they're gonna say, well, you didn't call me for 2 weeks, so there's nothing I can do for you. That may be true. That may be your company's policy, right? That may be what you have to do. But trauma-informed care can be, well, when I meet someone, I tell them what those expectations are, and then I let them know, like, hey, I won't be able to bring you back on my caseload, but like you can reach out and I can give you some other options, right? All the time, people who I can't serve anymore for whatever reason, whether they've been ejected from services or just because the case has closed, right? I tend to have a policy where it'd be like, I just sort of hot potato people, and that really makes people feel incredibly safe. I'm not doing a lot of work, and that's true for me. That's not necessarily true for you. This is just an example, right? But I'll just hot potato people, be like, absolutely, and so you can go over here, right? Cool, thank you for calling me. You can go over here, right? And that safety from rejection is also to allow people to consistently feel like coming to you with their behavior, thought, feeling, or need was a valid choice, even if you're not the person to support them further, right? If you're working in higher education and you're like, oh, this is a Title IX issue, right? We're gonna have to like report something, and you're like, that's not who I am, right? You can stop, thank them for sharing, and bring them to where they need to go, right? Because you just interrupted the idea that telling the truth is a problem, which is a lesson many of us got very hard as small people and is very hard to unlearn. And then we already actually talked about this a little bit, but the idea of the safety from the unknown, right? Setting expectation with clarity and kindness keeps people from the anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen and the fear of all the ways that can break bad, because they have evidence that it might. They may not have evidence from you, but what's happening right now is not about you. When it comes to trauma-informed care, that's one of the most important things we can learn. What is happening to me in this moment with this person is very likely not about me. Maybe about someone who looks like me. May not even be about somebody who looks like me. I always think it's fun when I get like the backlash from like something somebody's dad is doing. I'm like, it's interesting that I reminded you of them. But I didn't. It was just the one thing I said. And I can't know all of that, which is why this is not a list of tasks. You cannot know everything that's going to trigger someone because trauma is nuanced and complicated and personal. Two people can have the exact same experience and one of them can be really set off by this thing and one of them can be really set off by this thing. You can't predict it, which is why you respond to it, right? You can't plan for how you're going to be trauma-informed in a conversation with someone. You can plan for how you're going to be trauma-informed overall, a little bit, but mostly you have to stop, breathe, and respond to the person in front of you. Trustworthiness and transparency. So transparency is inherently at odds with the dominant culture norms. Whew, why is that phrase hard? We live in an incredibly passive-aggressive society. It is the way we coach people to be, particularly in the workplace, like all the time, right? I was thinking as I was writing this down about an experience I had where I had had a weird conversation with a boss of mine, but I didn't feel like I was in trouble. And then someone else came up to me and was like, I'm so sorry that I told the boss you were totally messing up. I can tell you really have a good heart. And I was like, what is happening? I'm so confused, right? I don't understand. And what does confusion do? It re-traumatizes me because trauma is confusing. Initial trauma is the moment that our idea of the world as predictable, understandable, and safe breaks. So when I get really confused and I don't know what people expect from me or how to be like a real good person, because that's really important to me, I don't know what the expectations are, I don't know what the rules are, right? I experience re-traumatization. I put this in here particularly for those of you who are managers in the world, right? We as agencies, organizations, businesses, government peoples, do a much better job of setting clear expectations for clients than we do for the people we work with. One of the phrases that comes up in my job all the time is like, common sense is not common. And that's fine, but I don't even really like that because there's a reason it's not common. People are coming with different experiences, expectations, knowledge, right? And if we expect someone to walk in the door, do 2 weeks of onboarding, and then know what I want from them for the rest of their employment, I am not being trauma-informed. I am re-traumatizing that person because now I am a person in authority who has unclear expectations, which is the heart of what a lot of childhood trauma is. The person who's in charge of you is not, it's not clear, right? Is at odds with our dominant cultural norms. If you act in transparency, you will be at odds with dominant cultural norms, which is one of the reasons I say this is not about us being passive, right? Transparency is sometimes me telling someone that I'm working with, I'm feeling really frustrated right now. Trauma-informed care doesn't mean they never know how I feel. Actually, in fact, sometimes it's me specifically naming how I feel. Because in that space between them seeing me react and them trying to figure it out, there's a lot of space for interpretation. There's a lot of space for what we call transference, right? Which is when I look at you and I put somebody else's face on you, essentially, right? When I look at you and go, oh, well, what my dad would be saying is, right? What my uncle would think is, right? We transfer our thoughts about someone else onto the person in front of us. And I interrupt that by saying, whew, that makes me really sad, right? By being human with the people we're trying to treat as human. Does that make sense? Trust testing is not an insult. It is a privilege. Trust testing is when someone walks in, your employee, your client, your friend, and they act like they don't trust you. And that's rude because you went to a 1-hour training on trauma-informed care and you learned how to be really nice and soft and approachable. And they should trust you because you did all the things. You're trustworthy. You're trustworthy. No, you aren't. You're not. They have the right to ask you to prove your trustworthiness. Trust testing is, in fact, a privilege because it means that person is still there attempting to create relationship with you. If they've already decided the answer to the test, we're not getting anywhere. So if you're getting trust testing, which can look like telling you a half-truth, it can look like telling you something I'm ready for you to react to, right? My favorite example is like when I did A&D assessments for teens, they would always try and like throw the most like outrageous things at me possible, right? Of being like, well, I just am snorting cocaine through my eyeballs. And I'd be like, okay. And they're like, I'm joking, Amy. And you're like, it's my job to take you seriously, right? And did I seem a little less fun in that moment, which is hard for me, right? Yes, I did. But what did I establish for them? They're a person I take seriously, right? When we respond to trust testing by going, you don't have any reason to trust me, and that's okay. I hope I get the opportunity to earn it. Whether we do that through our actions or our words, I recommend both, right? That actually creates trust in that moment because demands for untested trust is an inherent portion of the grooming process that most people who have been abused as children experienced. You need to trust me because I am your uncle, your mom, your sister's friend, right? Like, you trust me? Like, we're all good. Just keep the secret, right? That's an inherent part of the grooming process. And you act in opposition to that when you acknowledge that they have no reason to trust you and they don't have to. You allow them the space to be like, you don't have to trust me, right? You do have to like have this conversation with me if you need this service, like that's true, but you also don't have to want the service. You don't have to do any of those things, which is where we get into the empowerment stuff, which I apparently deleted my slide for. But that's fine because we can just talk about it, right? Empowerment is the ability to have choice where people didn't have it before. Abuse is the removal of choice over our physical safety, over our emotional safety, over the way that we move through the world, right? And that choice that someone made a really long time ago tends to still feel like it's being made today. It feels incredibly unfair when we walk through the world having experienced trauma. It feels like something was stolen from us and that it wasn't stolen from anyone else, it's only me. And that choice allows people space to say, but what do you want to do with it? The act of choice takes people from the past and puts them in the present with an option for being in the future, right? What are we going to do with it? I hear it, I feel it, I'm with you. What do we want to do with it, right? I'm going to look at my notes because my slide disappeared, so I don't have my prompts. Boop. That is why having notes is helpful, even though I've looked at them like once the rest of this time. I don't have many more notes on that. It's okay.
Thanks for being transparent.
Trauma-informed care. No, but I mean truly, right? Me not acting like I have it all together is part of trauma-informed care, right? I once had someone be like, can you be formal? And I was like, I just don't have much interest in it, right? And there are certain situations where we are gonna be more formal or professional, right? But when we're engaging with trauma-informed care, we are trying to be human to the person we're interacting with, right? They are human, we are human, right? We are not just trying to be humane to them, right? We are trying to treat them as fully human in what we do. And a fully human person, just like you and I, gets to do whatever they want. They have to deal with the consequences of it, right? But they get to choose. They've just forgotten. There's a phrase in trauma recovery that we call learned helplessness, right? And the acts of empowerment combat learned helplessness, because learned helplessness is, there's no point in trying because I already know how it's gonna go. And once upon a time, that was probably true, but it's not here today. And again, just even the act of, you don't have to have this service. You don't have to work here. You get a choice, is incredibly empowering in and of itself. You have to be very careful how you say those things, right? Because you don't want to be like, you don't have to be here, right? Our tone really matters, right? But giving people the ability to consent to even continue with something they've already started is also incredibly important to interrupting that learned helplessness. Just in time, I want to talk a bit about some worker skills, which is to say specific things that you can do and that you can teach the people that you work with to do in order to act on trauma-informed care. The first one I have on here is emotional regulation. And that's not for the person you serve, it's actually for you, right? The act of emotional regulation, oh, I put them in a funny order, fun. Okay, there we go. We can, in emotional regulation, we can self-regulate. You've probably heard me say it a handful of times. You take a deep breath, and then what do, right? I coach a lot of the young workers that I work with to release their urgency, right? Because for as long as the person is in this space with us, there's still opportunity to change course. For as long as this person is in this space with us, they're still safe, right? There's still opportunity and movement for as long as we're here. So if we're here, we can release the urgency of, oh, we gotta get this thing done right now. We experience a lot of pressure. We're a lot of really busy people, I'm sure, right? But taking a deep breath and releasing that urgency allows us to be present in the interaction, which allows them to be present. We model, but we also self-regulate, right? Don't judge yourself for being frustrated because you just went out and learned a bunch of stuff about trauma and you're like, I am such a jerk for still thinking that that person's rude for scoffing at me. I shouldn't feel that way. Trauma-inform yourself, right? You're not a jerk. It's frustrating. You get to be frustrated. It's how you move forward from there that creates trauma-informed care. It's not all of a sudden thinking that everyone's dandy all the time. I super don't. But more often than I used to, I take a deep breath. I go, whew, that was frustrating. But what do I want for this person? And I move from there, right? Also taking a break and really this is a great place to have like policy and practice in your organizations as well, right? To how do we determine that the people who are working on the front lines, right, can take a break when necessary, right? Not just having scheduled 15-minute breaks, but how do we work together to like, tag me in, dude, right? So you can go take a break, and it's a 2-minute break, but I just like need to close my eyes and take a deep breath and keep moving, right? Take a break with the person, right? Whew, you're frustrated, I'm frustrated. I need a second to take a deep breath. Do you want to join me, right? And then we can keep moving. Also, self-regulation includes the things we do outside of that moment as well, right? Includes making sure that if we know we have a stressful day that we eat all of our meals and drink all of our water, which seems so silly. It seems so silly. People tell you it a million times a day, but boy, oh boy, are your cortisol levels, which are directly related to your stress response, balanced out when you just like eat a granola bar, you know? Even if that's all you can do. Take some sips of water, right? Give yourself a second to care for yourself when you know that the thing that you're doing next might be, when you have a hard person about to walk into your office, eat a snack, right? It seems silly, but it really works because you've communicated. You know why? Because way back in the day when we were cave people, food and water were an indication that we were safe. A starvation response means that we are surviving. So when you feed yourself, when you water yourself, you move yourself out of survival mode. So do yourself the favor, right? The other thing that we can do is co-regulating, which is something that we can do both with the person we're serving or with a coworker, with a staff member, right? Co-regulation can be things we do ahead of time, like setting the scene, right? So like I never bring a client into an office that has overhead lights on. That may seem silly. And it may be silly for you or not an option for you, but I always try and be like, it's lamp time, right? We're gonna have to have a stressful conversation, so the lights are calming, right? Because I don't want you to feel like you're in a medical office for us to have this conversation, right? It's just not gonna help. It can look like arranging the chairs in a way that makes people feel safe, right? One of the things we do in every counseling office we have is that no one ever has their back to the door. Right? So in every space, people in the seats that clients sit in, they can always see the door so that they know they have an exit, right? Matching someone's volume and tone. This is one of the best skills for co-regulating when things start to get intense. You can also lead with this, right? So it's not just matching, but often people will match you as well. I don't want to whisper when someone's yelling at me because then we're not communicating. But I might talk a little bit louder, but a lot slower, right? Or if they're whispering because they're feeling really timid, I can get down into that with them. I said I can get down into that with them, for those of you who can't hear me from all the way over there, right? Checking your physical presence, one of the things I used to do with kids all the time, and it helped me too, is when I worked in residential facilities, kids would like get angsty and sit on the ground in the hallway, and I just sit on the ground across from them, right? It de-escalates them because I'm not doing this, and then now it actually de-escalates me, right? And I model some like chill body language, right? I don't sit like this, right? But I model some like calm body language, but I get on their level, right? I get in step. One of the things that I tell people a lot, the best visual I have for it is not very good, but we'll go with it, right? Is instead of the problem at hand being something in between us that we're knocking up against, the act of trauma-informed care is to get out from behind it and look at it together, right? Even if they're bringing the problem in, even if the problem is we don't like each other very much right now, which really makes us want to do this, getting out from behind it and going, so what are we going to do about that together, right? Getting in sync with the people that we're serving is an act of co-regulation because I feel less tense because now I'm not in a conflict, right? Using reflective language, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Prompts and strategies. This is something that, again, we can co-regulate because if you have someone who's having a difficult time and you're supporting the staff member who's helping them, right? You can problem solve with them, right? You can pop in and be a fresh face, right? That's where we relieve people, right? This looks like it's starting to go sideways, so I come in and I talk and I'm kind and I don't know what's happening, so it's not weird that I'm totally chill about it, right? And we support people and we see what we need to do to move forward, right? How do we support each other? The other is to use our active listening skills. Similar to the principles of trauma-informed care, you can find lists of like 12 active listening skills. I didn't do that though, because that's too many for our short space. There's also, if you ever get the opportunity, I would like to encourage you to take a training on what we call motivational interviewing, which is really just like the gold standard of doing active listening. Right? It is technically like a treatment modality, but I specifically did it for a bunch of housing people really recently, because it's basically about how to have a conversation with someone about change that they're resistant to, right? Not necessarily to get them to do the thing you want to do, but also maybe that's what's going to happen because we're trying to get to the thing that they want, right? Motivational interviewing is an incredibly trauma-informed strategy. Just checking my time. We're okay. First is just to pay attention, right? So I'm not active listening if I'm doing this while I talk to you, right? If I have to do that, I always acknowledge it, right? So if I have to write something down while I'm talking to someone, because that's the type of work we're doing together, I acknowledge that that's what I'm doing. And I try, and this is a little bit of a learned skill, trust me, to write a little bit while I'm looking at them. Even if it's just every few seconds, right? To really give the, like, I am listening to you, but I do have to write this thing down, right? To withhold your judgment. At the end of the day, whether you think it's a good way to handle it or not is not going to change that it's happening. So release the judgment and the need that we all have to categorize things into good and bad, right? Release it and be present with the person in the conversation you're having, right? And then reflect what you're hearing. So reflective listening is actually specifically a motivational interviewing skill. But reflective listening is saying things like, what I hear you saying is, right? We do that because I want to make sure that what I'm hearing you say is what you're saying to me, right? Is anyone bilingual in the room? Okay, there we go, right? How often is a direct translation of something not accurate? Yeah, right? I was going to my nephew's birthday party, mi sobrino's birthday party yesterday, and I had a moment after I've been married for several years, and I was like, wait a second, cumpleaños doesn't translate to birthday? And he was like, no, it's completed year. And I was like, oh, okay, well, there you go, right? And it has a different meaning in this very subtle way. Even though when someone says cumpleaños, I'm like, oh yeah, birthday. It's like, yes, except for maybe it has the same purpose, but it's a slightly different thing. And so me making sure what I hear is what's being said is the only way we're gonna move towards an appropriate solution together, right? Because if we have different ideas of what we're trying to do, well, then we're working on two different projects and just kind of trying to slap them together, and it's not going to make any sense, right? Clarify. This is part of that, right? Sometimes I'll say, correct me if I'm wrong, right? Am I hearing this correctly, right? These kind of pair together. But that's also an opportunity for you to clarify what you're saying, right? When it comes to trauma-informed care, the burden for clarity is on you. It's not on the person we're serving. Again, whether they're a staff member or someone who's come to get the services of our organization, the burden of being clear is on you, the person offering care, right? So making sure we clarify, because in this reflective listening, often what we'll find is like, oh, we're not talking about the same thing, right? Okay, so what I'm trying to say is, can you tell me what's not making sense? I'm hearing this, you're hearing this, right? Offering clarification. And then summarizing, right? And this is at the end of our conversation we summarize, generally, sometimes in the middle of it, but mostly at the end of the conversation. Because what happens in trauma response? We forget things. And people generally calm down throughout this conversation. But that also means they maybe weren't so calm at the beginning of the conversation. So summarizing gives us the opportunity to know that we're exiting this conversation with shared meaning, right? With a shared plan, with a shared strategy, right? That's that collaboration piece we were talking about earlier. And then, of course, you can share either your own thoughts, emotions, feelings, reflections, but there's a reason it's number 6, right? That it is after you've heard what the person you're serving, in whatever sense, is experiencing, you've moved through it, you've worked to understand, you've actively listened. That is when you share, oh, yeah, this has been a really hard day. Or the other thing I want to make sure you know is, because again, they will also remember it the most at the end of this conversation. Does that make sense? And then with my last few minutes, I have to go back because I put them in the wrong order. I want to talk about strengths language. Strengths language or strengths-based language is a term specifically from social work. It is person first and it is resilience focused, which is to say, I don't call my clients manipulative. I say that my clients are working with a skill to get what they want. I don't call my clients demanding. My clients are clearly expressing what they need. And I don't make those switches to, like, you guys know about virtue signaling? That's not what I'm doing. Maybe sometimes. Maybe sometimes that's all I've got, right? That's all that I can muster behind it, right? But we're doing it because when I talk about the people I serve differently, I think about the people I serve differently, right? Most of the language we use inside of a medical system or a cultural system is what we call deficit-based language, right? We are labeling people by their most difficult quality for us to tolerate, right? They're an addict, they're hostile, they're helpless, they're lazy, they're unfit, they're resistant. Yuck. I don't want to be any of those things, and I don't want to talk to somebody who thinks I am. But strengths-based language puts the person first and focuses on the fact that these behaviors are most often a trauma response or symptom. People started doing these things because it was working for them. They are evidence-based practices. So what is that intended to do? That's what we're doing with strengths-based language. What resilience is it reflecting? What effort towards survival is it reflecting, right? They're a person with a substance use disorder. Very simple, right? I can just say, like, they're not an addict. That's not all they are. But they are a person with this thing. That's still true. If they're hostile or aggressive, they're protective of themselves, of others, right? Aggression is often an effort to protect. Even if it's interpersonal violence, it's an effort to protect me from the way I'm feeling, from what I'm thinking, from what I think might happen, right? If somebody's lazy, they're probably ambivalent, right? They don't know what they want yet, and that's okay. People don't have to know what they want all day, every day, right? If someone's manipulative, I love this one, they're resourceful. That may not always be true, but also sometimes it is, right? Talk about like a con artist, that's a very resourceful person. Do I think they should continue conning people? No, because strengths-based language is not a permission to continue a behavior. It's an understanding that the behavior has a purpose, that it's being done for a reason, that it's working for them for some reason. And you get the benefit of being a little bit further out and going, it ain't gonna keep working if you keep doing that. And you can support people through that, right? People aren't resistant, they're choosing not to. I hate when they call people treatment resistant. They're choosing to not do it. They don't have to. People choose to not go to treatment every day. People choose to not access your services every day. That is their human right. They don't have to, even if you think or know or feel very deeply that it would be better for them if they did, right? And people do not abuse the system. They're self-advocating. They're getting what they want and what they need in the ways they know how. Can you be frustrated that that means that they're getting something or doing something or whatever that you don't feel like they deserve? Yeah, of course you can. But the more you talk about someone as a criminal or as defined by the worst things that have ever happened to them, the less you are able to see them as a fully human person who is much, much more than that. Yeah? Okay, I've run out of time. Thank you! Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. I just put my email up here in case you have questions, comments, concerns you want to reach out with. I am going on vacation on Wednesday, so I won't answer after that, but feel free to reach out, and I'd be more than happy to chat some more. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.